Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're peeling back the layers on something absolutely fundamental to being human. How do we learn, not just from stubbing their toe, but from simply watching everyone else?
It's a powerful question. And we've got a stack of sources here, foundational papers, modern research, all pointing to a theory that really flipped psychology's view of learning on its head. Albert Bandura's social learning theory.
Think about it. How did you learn which fork to use at a fancy dinner? Probably not trial and error involving mashed potatoes everywhere.
Right.
Or how did you pick up that specific phrase your friend uses all the time? It wasn't from a textbook, was it?
Definitely not.
So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack this theory, understand its, well, sometimes surprising core ideas, revisit those famous experiments that aim to prove it.
Oh yeah, the Bobo doll.
Exactly. And see its fingerprints all over our world today, especially online, and look honestly at what it explains and maybe where it still leaves us scratching our heads a bit.
And this deep dive is really for you, our curious listener, who wants to cut through the academic jargon and get straight to the practical insights. Why we behave the way we do and how much of it comes from just being social creatures.
All right, let's dive in. Okay, so to really get why social learning theory was such a big deal, we kind of need to set the scene. What was the thinking before Bandura?
Well, for a long time, psychology was dominated by behaviorism. Pavlov, Skinner. Their focus was almost entirely on what you could see observable behavior and the direct consequences.
Learning was all about direct experience,
Yeah.
right? You do something happens to you, good or bad, and that shapes future actions.
Precisely. Stimulus, response, reward, punishment. That loop. And, it explains some learning pretty well.
But not everything.
No, not by a long shot.
Yeah.
It really struggled with complex behaviors learned quickly. Like you said, riding a bike just from watching, or learning not to touch a hot stove because you saw your sibling yelp. Behaviorism didn't have a great explanation for how we learn without personal trial and error, or getting that immediate reward or punishment ourselves.
It feels like there's a gap there. I see you do something, I learn something from that, even if I don't do it myself right then.
Exactly that gap. And that's where Albert Bandura stepped in. Back in the 1960s, he proposed social learning theory, SLT, arguing that a huge amount of our learning happens just by observing others, in social contexts.
So the first big takeaway, learning isn't just me in a buttle with my consequences, it's social.
Fundamentally social. We learn by watching other people's actions, their attitudes, and critically, what happens to them as a result.
Which leads to that other kind of radical idea for the time.
Oh yeah, that you can learn something, like really know it, without actually doing it yourself immediately. The learning happens internally.
So you acquire the knowledge, but performance might come later, or maybe never.
Exactly. That difference between acquisition and performance, that was a massive departure from strict behaviorism.
So SLT acts like a bridge then. It connects behaviorist ideas like consequences mattering.
Right. It doesn't throw reinforcement out completely.
But it adds the cognitive stuff. Thinking, remembering, watching others.
That's it. Perfectly.
Yeah.
It acknowledged reinforcement but said it's often processed socially and cognitively. It gave psychology this mechanism, observational learning, to explain how humans learn so efficiently, especially complex things. It recognized we're not just simple stimulus response machines.
And it means learning isn't just in school. It's, well, everywhere we see other people, including through media.
Everywhere. The classroom became much bigger.
Okay, so let's unpack this. If observational learning is the heart, what are the key concepts Bandura gave us?
Right, let's get into the mechanics. The first pillar, as we said, is observational learning itself, learning by watching models.
And models can be lots of different things.
Yeah, Bandura broke it down. First, you've got live models. These are actual people right there in front of you, demonstrating something. Think a teacher showing you how to solve a math problem, or a parent tying shoelaces.
Okay, straightforward.
Then, and this is incredibly relevant now, symbolic models. These are real or fictional characters we encounter through media books, films, TV shows, and crucially, online platforms.
So influencers on Instagram, characters in video games.
Absolutely. People we might never meet, but whose actions and perceived outcomes we observe constantly. The power of symbolic models has just exploded in the digital age.
Wow, yeah. Okay, what else?
There are also verbal instructional models.
Yeah.
This is learning from descriptions or instructions without necessarily seeing the action performed. Think reading a recipe or following assembly instructions for furniture, or listening to a podcast explain something.
Ah, got it. And we copy these models.
Sometimes it's direct imitation, just copying the behavior. But other times it's identification. We adopt behaviors because we relate to the model, we want to be associated with them. Maybe we expect similar positive outcomes if we act like them.
Okay, but Bandura said it's not just monkey see, monkey do. There's thinking involved.
Yes. This is where the cognitive aspect really shines. He proposed the four mediational processes. Think of these as the mental steps that happen between observing the model and potentially performing the behavior. They mediate or bridge the gap.
What are they? What's the first step?
First is attention. You actually have to notice the model and pay attention to the important parts of their behavior. If you're distracted or the model isn't interesting or relevant to you, you won't learn much.
Makes sense. Gotta be tuned in.
Right. Second, retention. You have to be able to remember what you observed. This involves encoding the information, maybe as mental images or verbal descriptions. Practice or mental rehearsal helps here.
Okay, I saw it, I remember it. Now what?
Step 3 is reproduction, sometimes called motor reproduction. You need the actual physical and cognitive ability to replicate the behavior. I can watch a gymnast do amazing flips, but retention won't help me reproduce that. My body isn't capable.
Right, you need the skills or physical capacity. Okay, I see it, remember it, I can do it. What's the final filter?
The big one, motivation. Do you actually want to perform the behavior? This is where consequences loop back in, but often vicariously.
Vicarious, meaning learning from what happens to the model.
Exactly, vicarious reinforcement and punishment. This is so key. If you see the model being rewarded or praised for their actions, you're more motivated to imitate them. If you see them getting punished or facing negative consequences, you're much less likely to copy them.
That's incredibly efficient, isn't it? Learning from someone else's experience without taking the risk yourself.
Hugely efficient. It allows us to learn social rules, avoid dangers, and pick up beneficial behaviors much faster than if we had to try everything ourselves.
And there's another big motivator you mentioned.
Yes, and it became even more central later. Self-efficacy. This is your personal belief in your own ability to successfully perform that specific behavior and get a desired outcome.
So it's not just, can I physically do this, but do I believe I can succeed at this?
Precisely. And that belief is incredibly powerful. High self-efficacy. You're more likely to try challenging things, put in more effort, stick with it when it gets tough. Low self-efficacy. You might avoid the behavior altogether, even if you technically have the skills. It explains so much individual variation.
And anticipating a reward can work too, right?
Yes, the expectation of future reinforcement. Just thinking you'll get a reward can be motivating. So these four processes, attention, retention, reproduction, motivation, really highlight that learning and performance are distinct. You can learn something, but lack the motivation or self-efficacy to actually do it.
And quickly, the last major concept here, reciprocal determinism.
But reciprocal determinism. This is the idea that it's not a one-way street environment shapes behavior or personal factors shape behavior. It's a dynamic triangle.
What's in the triangle?
Your behavior, B, your personal factors, P, thoughts, beliefs, personality, biology, and the environment, E. They all continuously influence each other.
Give me an example.
Okay. Your belief about being bad at math, P, might lead you to avoid math homework, B, which leads to poor grades and maybe negative feedback from the teacher, E, which then reinforces your belief that you're bad at math, P. It's a constant interplay.
So we're not just puppets of our environment, we influence it too, based on our thoughts and actions.
Exactly. It emphasizes that individuals are active agents in their own lives.
So this theory sounds good, but Bandura needed to show it in action, right?
Yeah.
Which brings us to the infamous Bobo doll experiments.
Infamous is a good word for them. They were groundbreaking, but also sparked a lot of debate. They were explicitly designed to demonstrate observational learning, challenging that behaviorist need for direct reinforcement.
What was the basic setup? It involved kids and an inflatable doll.
Yes, preschool-age children. They'd watch an adult model in a room with various toys, including this inflatable Bobo doll that bounces back up when you hit it.
And the adult acted differently depending on the group.
That was the crucial variable. One group of kids watched an adult model being very aggressive towards the Bobo doll, hitting it with a mallet, punching it, kicking it, shouting aggressive things like, "Sock him."
Wow, okay. Intense.
Another group watched an adult model play quietly with other toys, completely ignoring the Bobo doll. And a third group, the control, saw no model at all.
So, very different scenarios. Then what?
After watching the model, the children were usually put through what they called a mild aggression arousal phase. Basically shown some really cool toys, but told they couldn't play with them yet.
Why do that?
To create a little frustration, ensuring that any aggression shown later wasn't just general crankiness, but potentially linked to the modeling they just witnessed. Then, they were taken to another room with toys, including the Bobo doll, and researchers watched through a one-way mirror.
And what did they find? Did watching the aggressive adult make a difference?
A huge difference. The children who had observed the aggressive model were significantly more likely to behave aggressively towards the Bobo doll themselves compared to the children in the other two groups.
And was it specific? Did they copy the adult?
Yes, and this was the clincher. They didn't just show more aggression in general. They often imitated the exact novel aggressive behaviors they had seen the adult perform using the mallet the same way, repeating the specific phrases. This strongly suggested they had learned new aggressive behaviors purely through observation.
They learned the script, not just the feeling.
Precisely. They also sometimes showed more generalized aggression, but the imitation of specific acts was undeniable. And later studies replicated this using filmed models, showing that symbolic models in media could have the same effect.
Did they test the consequence part too? Like, what if the aggressive adult was punished?
They did. In subsequent studies, if the children saw the aggressive model being rewarded or praised, they imitated the aggression even more. But if they saw the model being punished or scolded, their imitation of aggression dropped significantly.
Ah, vicarious reinforcement and punishment in action.
Exactly. It powerfully demonstrated that observing the consequences for the model's behavior strongly influenced whether the children would perform the behavior themselves.
So what was the big impact of these studies?
Well, first, they provided really strong empirical support for observational learning, that learning can happen without direct reinforcement. Second, they highlighted the power of vicarious consequences. Third, they really kick off the massive and still ongoing debate about media violence and its effects on children.
Yeah, that debate is definitely still alive.
And it challenged the older idea of catharsis, the notion that watching violence gets aggression out of your system. Bandura's work suggested the opposite. Watching it can teach it and make it more likely.
It's interesting, even the ethical worries about the experiments.
Right. The very concern that showing kids aggression might harm them kind of proved Bandura's point about the power of observed models, didn't it?
Okay, so SLT was a big step, but Bandura kept refining things, didn't he? The theory grew.
He did. His thinking evolved, especially incorporating more research on cognitive processes. And in 1986, he formally renamed the theory Social Cognitive Theory, or SCT.
Why the change? Was SLT not cutting it anymore?
It wasn't that SLT was wrong, but he wanted to put a much stronger emphasis on the cognitive part. Thinking, judging, believing, self-reflection. He saw these as central mechanisms, not just byproducts. He wanted to make it crystal clear that learners are active processors of information, not just passive observers.
So less focus on just the social learning part and more on the cognitive engine driving it.
Exactly. And it also helped differentiate his increasingly comprehensive theory from other, perhaps simpler notions of social learning that might have stayed closer to behaviorist roots. SCT is really a broader framework.
So what concepts got a bigger spotlight in SCT?
Two really stand out. First, self-efficacy. We talked about it as a motivator in SLT, but in SCT, it became an absolute cornerstone.
Remind me, that's my belief I can do something specific.
Yes, your belief in your own capability to organize and execute the courses of action required to manage prospective situations. It's not just having the skill, it's the confidence you can use that skill effectively to reach a goal.
And why is that so important?
Because it influences almost everything. The choices you make, do you even attempt that challenging task? How much effort you put in, how long you persist when things get difficult, even your emotional reactions like stress or anxiety. Bandura saw self-efficacy as fundamental to human agency, our capacity to exert influence over our own functioning and the course of events.
It really helps explain why people with similar abilities can achieve such different things.
Absolutely. And the second major area SCT emphasized was self-regulation.
Okay, what's that?
It's our ability to monitor and control our own thoughts, feelings, and actions to achieve personal goals. It's something we learn and develop. It involves things like setting goals for ourselves, watching our own progress, self-observation, judging our performance against our standards, self-judgment, and reacting to our own behavior, maybe rewarding ourselves mentally or adjusting our approach, self-reaction.
So it's like becoming your own manager internally.
Pretty much. It's about moving from being primarily guided by external rewards and punishments to being able to direct our own behavior based on internal goals and standards. And underpinning all this in SCT is that strong emphasis on human agency. We're proactive. We use forethought to anticipate outcomes. We use symbols like language to reason and plan. We reflect on ourselves, and we actively shape our lives and environments.
And that reciprocal determinism idea, the triangle of influence.
Still central, often called triadic reciprocal determinism in SCT. That continuous dynamic interplay between personal factors, behavior, and the environment is key to understanding how we function and how change can happen from multiple angles.
Okay, theory is great, experiments are interesting, but where does this rubber meet the road? How does social cognitive theory actually play out in our everyday lives?
Oh, it's everywhere once you start looking. The applications are incredibly broad.
Let's take education first. Seems obvious there.
Totally. Yeah. Teachers are constant models, right? They model not just academic skills, but also problem-solving strategies, enthusiasm for learning, classroom behavior, how to interact respectfully. But don't underestimate peer models either.
How so?
Collaborative learning groups, peer tutoring students learn a ton by watching their classmates tackle problems, explain concepts, or demonstrate skills. Role-playing exercises are pure SCT. Even things like flipped classrooms, where students might watch video lectures at home that's learning from symbolic models.
And building self-efficacy is huge for teachers, I imagine.
Crucial. Good educators help students believe they can succeed. They break tasks down, create opportunities for mastery experiences, give encouraging feedback, show diverse role models achieving success. Seeing someone like me succeed can be incredibly powerful for a student's self-belief.
What about in psychology or therapy?
Direct applications there too. Modeling therapy, as we mentioned, is used for phobias. The therapist might model interacting calmly with the viewed stimulus, or the client watches videos. Therapists model communication skills, coping strategies, emotional regulation. In group therapy, people learn vicariously by observing how others navigate similar challenges and successes.
So you can learn better ways to think or cope by watching others do it.
Exactly. And encouraging healthier social circles, surrounding yourself with positive models that aligns perfectly too.
Okay, how about the workplace?
Training is a big one. Shadowing experienced colleagues, mentorship programs, classic observational learning. Leaders model desired behaviors, work ethic, communication styles. Creating a culture where people share knowledge, openly relies on modeling that behavior and seeing it valued. Workshops often use role-playing to practice skills learned through observation.
Public health campaigns, too.
Definitely. Think about anti-smoking ads using relatable figures, or campaigns promoting exercise or healthy eating. Often feature respected individuals, symbolic models, demonstrating the behavior and its benefits. Training doctors or nurses often involves observing procedures. Understanding how unhealthy behavior spread through social networks, often via observation and peer modeling, helps design interventions using positive models.
In just our own social circles, family, friends.
They are primary sources of social learning from day one. Family models language, norms, values, emotional responses. As we grow, peers become hugely influential models, shaping choices, interests, fashion, risk-taking, often based on observing what seems to lead to social rewards like acceptance or popularity.
Which brings us to the digital age. This feels like SCT on steroids.
It really, really does. Traditional media like TV and film have always been recognized as powerful sources of symbolic models, influencing attitudes and behaviors for decades. But social media, platforms like Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, they are relentless social learning environment.
Constant exposure to models.
Constant. Peers, influencers, celebrities, experts showcasing lifestyles, skills, opinions, trends. And the vicarious reinforcement is immediate and visible. Likes, shares, comments, views. This feedback loop powerfully drives imitation and conformity.
It shapes norms and identities so fast.
Incredibly fast. And it can spread information and misinformation like wildfire through observed endorsement or popularity. Our self-efficacy gets tangled up in it too, comparing ourselves to curated online versions of others.
Online learning platforms also fit here, right?
Yes. MOOCs, forums you learn from the instructor's modeling, but also from observing how other students approach problems. Ask questions, contribute answers. Collaboration features explicitly leveraged social learning, and success in online learning often heavily depends on self-regulation and self-efficacy, key SCT concepts.
What about newer tech, like VR and AR?
They offer incredibly potent new ways to learn through observation and practice. Imagine surgeons observing a complex procedure modeled perfectly in VR, then practicing it themselves in that simulated safe environment. Same for pilots, engineers, technicians. It combines observation of expert models with guided reproduction.
Huge potential, but maybe some hurdles too.
For sure. Cost, accessibility, designing effective and ethical simulations. But the underlying principle, learning by observing and doing based on models, is a powerful application of SCT.
So the key is always the model and the consequences.
Largely, yes. The effectiveness hinges on the model's credibility, relatability, the clarity of their actions, and the visibility of the consequences, positive or negative. Plus, those internal mediational processes have to click. But the sheer volume and accessibility of models today, especially online, really highlights the need for critical thinking. We need to be conscious consumers of the behaviors we're constantly observing.
Okay, so it's a powerful theory, clearly explains a lot, but no theory is perfect. Let's look critically. What are the big strengths and maybe some of the limitations or sticking points?
Absolutely. On the strength side, it's definitely comprehensive. It offers a much richer explanation for learning than pure behaviorism by integrating social context and, crucially, cognition. It can handle complex behaviors, attitudes, emotions.
And it's well supported.
Yes, there's a huge body of empirical support, starting with the Bobo doll work and continuing through decades of research on modeling, vicarious learning, self-efficacy, and self-regulation. And as we just discussed, it's incredibly practical. We see its principles working effectively in so many real-world settings.
It also seems quite adaptable.
It is. It's flexible. It accounts for different ways learning happens, observation, direct experience, and why people learn differently. A major strength is how it explicitly highlights cognition, bridging that gap between behaviorism and the cognitive revolution. And the emphasis on self-efficacy and agency is really empowering. It views humans as active shapers of their own destiny, not just passive responders.
All right, so what are the main criticisms or limitations people point out?
Well, one common point is that it doesn't fully integrate biological or genetic factors. The focus is heavily weighted towards nurture environment and cognition, with less detailed exploration of innate predispositions, or nature's role.
So it explains the learned parts better than the potentially built-in parts.
You could put it that way. Some also argue it might oversimplify certain things, like the nuances of developmental changes across the lifespan, or the full depth of cognitive processing that isn't directly tied to observation.
What about the lab-based origins?
Right. The reliance on early lab studies like Bobo doll raises questions about ecological validity. How well do those controlled findings translate to the messy, complex real world? And relatedly, there are the ethical concerns about exposing children to aggression in those experiments.
Measuring the internal stuff must be tricky too.
It is. Those internal mediational processes, attention, retention, motivation, are inherently difficult to observe and measure directly and objectively, which poses a challenge for rigorous testing of some aspects.
Does it explain all behavior?
No theory does. Critics point out that it doesn't explain everything. Sometimes novel behaviors emerge seemingly without clear models, or people act in ways directly counter to what they see being reinforced around them.
And the responsibility question, does it let people off the hook?
Some critics initially worried the focus on environment and models might seem to downplay personal responsibility. However, Bandura's later strong emphasis on agency, self-reflection, and self-regulation within SCT really counters this, highlighting our active role in choosing and shaping our behavior.
Any other potential biases?
Like many theories developed mid-century, there's a potential cultural bias. Much of the foundational research was done in Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, or weird societies. How social learning works, who counts as an influential model, what's valued these, can vary significantly across cultures. And it doesn't always deeply analyze how socioeconomic factors might limit or shape learning opportunities and access to positive models. But it's important to see these limitations in context. Many are common critiques for theories of that era. SLT-SCT provides a fundamental, incredibly useful framework, even if it needs cultural and contextual layers added.
Okay, so putting SLT and SCT in context, how does it stack up against other big learning theories we might know, like behaviorism, cognitivism, constructivism?
Good question. Let's start with behaviorism. Skinner, Pavlov. Since SLT was a direct reaction, the absolute biggest difference is the view of the learner. Behaviorism saw learners as kind of passive responders to the environment. SLT-SCT sees them as active information processors who think, anticipate, and choose.
And learning isn't the same as doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That learning versus performance distinction is key in SLT, whereas behaviorism often equated them. If you didn't see the behavior, learning hadn't occurred. SLT says, not so fast. It might have been learned, but just not performed yet.
Reinforcement is different too.
Yep. Behaviorism, direct reinforcement needed. SLT equals vicarious reinforcement, seeing others, works, and it's mediated by our thoughts and expectations. Plus, SLT focused much more on humans, while early behaviorism relied heavily on animal studies.
So SLT didn't ditch reinforcement, but it made it social and cognitive.
Precisely. It built upon it, integrated into a much richer model. Self-efficacy, for example, helps explain why the same reward doesn't motivate everyone equally.
Okay, how about cognitivism? Seems like there's overlap.
Huge overlap. Both value internal mental processes. In many ways, SLT-SCT is seen as a key part of, or at least a major bridge towards, the broader cognitive perspective in psychology. It put attention, memory, expectations right at the center of learning from others.
What's the main difference then? Is SLT just one part of cognitivism?
You could say that. SLT specifically focuses on cognition in the context of observational learning and social interaction. General cognitivism is a much wider umbrella, covering all sorts of mental functions, memory systems, problem-solving, language, decision-making that aren't necessarily tied to social learning.
Got it. And lastly, constructivism, Piaget, Vygotsky. They also emphasize active learners and social aspects.
Right, similarities there too. With Piaget, both see learners as active. But Piaget focused on individuals constructing knowledge through direct, hands-on interaction with the physical world, moving through distinct developmental stages. Bandura focused more on learning by observing social models. Piaget felt development drives learning. Bandura saw cognitive development as enabling more sophisticated imitation and observational learning.
And Vygotsky, he really emphasized the social.
He did. Like Bandura, Vygotsky saw social context as critical. But Vygotsky's focus was more on learning through direct interaction, collaboration, and language with a more knowledgeable other, MKO, in the zone of proximal development, CPD. Learning is co-constructed through that interaction. Bandura's theory allows for learning through observation without that direct reciprocal interaction like learning from media.
So a key distinction. Constructivism is more about learners building their own understanding, while SLT is more about acquiring behaviors or knowledge by observing others.
That's a pretty good summary of the emphasis. Constructivism is about active construction of knowledge. SLT is about acquiring ways of behaving and thinking by observing models and consequences. Though you could argue Vygotsky's framework could include observational learning as one way an MKO helps a learner in the ZPD.
So there you have it, our deep dive into social learning theory and its evolution into social cognitive theory.
Bandura really did fundamentally shift how we understand learning. He showed us undeniably the power of just watching others in our social world.
Those core ideas, observational learning, the mediational processes going on inside our heads, vicarious reinforcement, self-efficacy, that dynamic reciprocal determinism, they offer such a powerful lens for understanding ourselves.
Yeah, why we do what we do, how we pick things up, how attitudes form. It really bridged that gap between theories focusing only on external factors and those focusing only on internal thoughts. It showed how they dance together, especially socially.
And thinking about today's world, saturated with media, social platforms, online interactions, these ideas feel more relevant than ever, don't they?
Absolutely. We're constantly swimming in a sea of models, getting instant feedback loops that shape our behavior faster than ever before.
So for you, listening, understanding this theory can give you real insights into your own learning, your motivations, maybe even your anxieties. It helps you see how much you've absorbed from your environment and maybe empowers you to be more conscious about your influences and building your own self-belief.
It really puts the focus on being an active agent. And for society, it highlights the responsibility, doesn't it? Parents, teachers, media creators, leaders, the models they present have real consequences because observational learning is so fundamental.
The story's definitely not finished, especially with technology changing how we connect and observe each other constantly.
For sure.
So, here's a final thought to leave you with. Given this immense power of social modeling, especially amplified in the digital age, how can we intentionally cultivate more positive social learning environments, both for ourselves and for others? And what role does critical thinking play in filtering the flood of models we encounter online every day?
Great question to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gave you some valuable new insights into the social side of learning.
Catch you on the next one.